Hi, I'm Bill Wright. In this last teaching from Pastor Dick Woodward's series called Sermon on the Mount, you're being given an invitation. An invitation to what, you ask? Well, let's find out. Here's Pastor Woodward in his final message from the series entitled Sermon on the Mount.
In this study, we come to our final and concluding study of this great teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. We have come to the end of the teaching, which will be in the form of an invitation. We've seen since we began chapter 7 that in chapter 7 Jesus is bringing things to a verdict. But beginning at verse 13, he will do that by giving an invitation. Remember when we had our first study about this great teaching, we pointed out in our first study how the teaching was going to end. The teaching began by Jesus challenging some people who at first were part of a multitude of people with all kinds of problems to whom Jesus was ministering. He invited out of that multitude some people to join him on the mountaintop where he gave all this teaching. We said that when he had that retreat in session on the mountaintop, he had divided that multitude into two groups. At the bottom of the mountain were the people who were still part of the problem, and perhaps would always be part of the problem. But on the mountaintop with him being instructed were the people who wanted to know how to be part of the solution and part of the answer. So the context and the strategy of the Sermon on the Mount teaching, which we call the First Christian Retreat, faced us with this question: are you part of the problem or part of the answer, part of the solution? Are you part of the answer of Jesus or just another question mark? Where are you? Are you at the bottom of the mountain or are you on the top of the mountain? Now, the teaching is given to the people on the top of the mountain. So if you answered that first question by saying, by the grace of God, I want to be on the mountaintop with Jesus. I don't want to be part of the problem. I don't want to be just another question mark. I want to be part of the solution and part of the answer. I'm a professed believer in Jesus. I'm a follower of his, and I want to be part of his solution, part of his answer. Now, if you answered the question that way at the beginning, then all the teaching of Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is addressed to you. But at the conclusion of the teaching, you and I who profess to follow Jesus and who profess to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, part of his answer, part of his solution, we are faced with an awesome invitation. And the thrust of this concluding invitation is, what kind of a solution are you? What kind of an answer are you? What kind of a disciple are you? Because this is an invitation given to disciples. It's not really an invitation for salvation, as I understand it. It's not really given to a mixed multitude where some are believers and some are not. All the people who heard this invitation profess to be believers. And the thrust of the invitation is not, are you saved or lost, or are you a believer or an unbeliever? It's often used that way. But in my opinion, the thrust of this invitation is, what kind of a solution are you? What kind of a disciple are you? Because there are two possibilities. 3 times in this invitation, Jesus will say, there are 2 kinds of professing disciples. He will say, there are the many and the few. The many think there's an easy way to be a solution, to be an answer, to be salt and light. But they don't ever become solutions or answers. They're not really salt and light. They just profess to be. If you watch what happens to the many who follow the lines of least resistance and think that there's an easy way to be part of my answer and solution, I think you'll decide you don't want to be one of the many. But then there are the few. There's another kind of disciple. The few know that there is no easy way. The many believe that it starts with a wide gate, which is followed by a broad, level road, but that funnels down to destruction. Now many are traveling that road who profess to be my disciples, Jesus is saying. But then there are the few. They know that the gate is small, and that the road that follows that gate is narrow, difficult, and disciplined, but it leads to life. But only a few are finding it. The challenge clearly in verses 13 and 14 is simply this: are you one of the many or one of the few? What kind of a disciple are you? Here's the invitation: enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. The next part of the invitation is in verses 15 through 20. And the thrust of this paragraph is, are you false or true? Nobody needed to tell Jesus that there were going to be a lot of professed disciples that weren't really true disciples. I've always been amazed at how people think that it's their duty to tell us pastors that there are a lot of hypocrites in the church. I've called on people as a pastor, and they would say, there are too many hypocrites in the church, Pastor. That's why I'm not interested in the church. And they profess to tell me about the hypocrites in the church. I feel like saying to people like that, listen, I'm the expert on that subject. Nobody knows about the hypocrites in the church like the pastors do. We know that everybody that professes to be a follower of Christ is not a follower of Christ, and Jesus knew that. In this part of the invitation, Jesus is saying, now here are two possibilities. You can be a real disciple, or you can be as phony as a $3 bill. You can be a phony disciple. Now here again, it's what kind of a disciple are you? You might call this invitation in its three parts, 2 men in a pew, which one are you? Because this is addressed to the men in the pew, to the people in the pew. It's not addressed to the great unwashed. It's not addressed to the mixed multitude. It's addressed to professing believers, people in the pews. And it's 2 people in a pew, which one are you? That's the kind of invitation it is. Listen to the way this one reads. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Here again we have questions. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Isn't this awesome? I think it is. Jesus is giving us a profile of the church, and he's not naive. He knows what the church is going to be like. If you study church history, it can be a challenge to your faith. There are periods of church history that are so dark, they can just disillusion you. When you read about things like the Inquisitions and some of the practices of the church throughout church history, you wonder as you read them, how could it ever have come to that? How could anybody in the name of Jesus Christ have done things like that and claim to be his church? Well, this is not news to Jesus. The Christ who was and the Christ who is, he's not disillusioned about that. He told us right up front at the starting gate that it was going to be like that. He said, there is the false and the true. And so the challenge is, 2 people in the pew, which one are you? Are you for real? By the grace of God, are you for real? Or are you a phony? You know, the scriptures tell us in a lot of places, like 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, the Apostle Paul says, examine yourselves and see whether or not you're in the faith. Prove yourselves, know yourselves. One translation puts it this way, after all, you could be counterfeits. All of us are exhorted in the Scripture to examine ourselves. By the grace of God, are we real disciples of Jesus? By the grace of God, do we have the reality along with the rite, R-I-T-E? Or are we just liturgy? Are we just form? Do we have the form of godliness and deny the power thereof? To use a quote from the Apostle Paul, are we for real by the grace of God? That's a challenge that each of us should face continuously. Now, being the realist that he was, to me this is awesome teaching. You don't pick grapes from thorn bushes, and you don't pick figs from thistles. Now here is a law. This is again the natural law in the spiritual world. Every good tree bears good fruit. Bad trees bear bad fruit. Now here it's stated even more emphatically, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit. Isn't that an interesting statement? If by the grace of God now, not just because of your own good works or goodness, but if by the grace of God the Christ who is lives in you, if he has converted you, if he has regenerated you, if you're a new creation because he's done the miracle of the new birth within you, and in that sense you are for real, not because of your own efforts or your own goodness, but because of his efforts and his goodness. If the miracle is in you, and you are therefore a good tree, you cannot bear bad fruit. Isn't that a wonderful promise? And in the same way, a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. You cannot fake it. I've heard people actually suggest this little slogan, fake it till you make it. Well, that may work in some things, but I don't believe that's meant to work in the Church of Jesus Christ. A lot of people, I believe, in the church perhaps have adopted that idea, fake it till you make it, and some of them never seem to make it. But here's realism, folks. This is down-to-earth realism. There are the two possibilities, the good tree and the bad tree. Now, sooner or later, you'll know by the fruit. And here's the great law. Good trees cannot bear bad fruit. Bad trees cannot bear good fruit. So ultimately, you're going to know what kind of tree you are, and then what kind of trees they are. And then you have this teaching, which is consistent with the Lord's teaching in other places. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Remember he said that in John chapter 15? In John chapter 15, he exhorted us to be fruitful. And one of the reasons why he said we must be fruitful is there's no such thing as a fruitless disciple of mine. He said that he was like a vine and we were like branches aligned with that vine, plugged into that vine. And he said, now, if a branch that abides in this vine that I am is fruitful, my Father will cut it back and prune it and make it more fruitful. But if there were such a thing as a branch in me that wasn't fruitful, well, he would cut it away, not cut it back to improve its fruit quality and quantity, but cut it away and throw it on the ground. And then men, he said, would gather up those dead branches and throw them on the fire. Sooner or later, men would realize that they were not alive, real branches, that they were dead branches. Well, here you have the awesome teaching again. Every tree that does not eventually, ultimately bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Awesome teaching. And the challenge is, by the grace of God, are you one of the true disciples of Jesus, or are you false? Are you a phony? And then in the last two paragraphs, as my translation divides them up, you have this emphasis. Are you one of those who say, or one of those who do? Nobody was ever more practical than Jesus. I believe you can sum up this third part of his great invitation this way. What you really believe you do, and all the rest is just religious talk. You see all those people down there at the bottom of the hill? They don't need religious talk. Religious talk isn't going to solve their problems. Religious talk isn't going to give them answers. The answer that I want you to be, the solution that I want you to be, that is not just a matter of talk. There are a lot of people who talk Christianity. There are a lot of people who can give you lectures on theology, and they can explain verses of the Bible, and of course there are those who can tell you what's wrong with everybody else. But Jesus on the mountaintop wasn't recruiting people who could lecture about these things. I heard about a conference of students, an international conference, where they were discussing the mission of the church, and there were people there from many, many nations. And as they were discussing the different strategies they had for evangelizing the world, or their part of the world, how they got out the word and how they got the literature printed and so forth, they asked a girl from Africa, what do you African Christians do? And she said, well, what we do is we live mostly in villages, so we just take 2 or 3 families who really know the Lord, and we send them to a village and tell them to live in that village for 2 years and just work and make their living and just live everyday life in the midst of that village. And then when the people in that village see how followers of Christ live and what their values are, they want to be believers. I think that was an excellent strategy for evangelism. So much of our evangelism is just propaganda. It's just religious talk. We think we are to be experts on theology and doctrine and religious talk, but like Nicodemus, when he came to Jesus by night, he said, "We've seen the things you do, and so we know that you are a rabbi come from God." What Nicodemus was saying in so many words was, "I've seen the way you live, and now I want to hear your religious talk." When we studied the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John, remember we said it's still that way today. We think people are interested in our religious talk. But people are interested in the religious talk after they've seen somebody walk the walk. You've got to walk the talk. That's what Jesus is saying. Now listen to this. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Here's another awesome teaching. "Many will say to me on that day," meaning the judgment day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Well, in these two paragraphs, verses 21 through 23 and then 24 through 27, Jesus is finishing out his great invitation. Two people in a pew, which one are you? Are you one of the many who think that you can be a solution and an answer, the salt of the earth and the light of the world, by passing through a big gate that's followed by a wide, level way that leads nowhere? Are you one of the many who think there's an easy way to be a solution? All you have to do is follow the lines of least resistance. Or are you one of the few who know that it's a straight gate, as the Authorized Version says, followed by a narrow, difficult, disciplined way of discipleship? Jesus said only few are finding that that's the way to be a solution. But that's the first possibility in his invitation. Are you one of the many or one of the few? And then, are you false or are you true? Really a disciple of mine? And then finally this challenge. Are you one of those who say or one of those who do? Now there are two awesome teachings here in connection with being a talker or a doer. Here's one of the most awesome passages in the Scripture. "Many will say to me on that day," meaning the judgment. "Many will come to me at the judgment, and they'll sum up their life on earth with 3 words, many wonderful works. But then I'm going to tell them my evaluation of the sum total of the value of their existence on earth, and I'm going to use 3 words, worker of iniquity." That's an awesome teaching. He's going to say to them, I never knew you. So all the works you did, which include exorcism and miracles, all those things had nothing to do with me. That was your thing. I never knew you. There wasn't a meaningful coming to me. There was just a going. You did all that in your own strength. You did all that in what Paul would call the work of the flesh. I had nothing to do with that. Get out of my sight. Isn't that awesome? How could people go through life and miss it by so wide a margin? Well, maybe they never really got into the teaching of these 3 chapters and understood in depth what Jesus was really saying. And then the second way it's illustrated for us is the favorite illustration of many people. If all of us had canvases and paints and paintbrushes, and I said to everybody, now we're going to play a game called word association. Suppose all of us were skilled artists or painters, and I said, I'm going to speak a word, and then I want you to paint a picture. Suppose I spoke the word life. Now paint. What is life? Well, I understand that young people might paint the picture of somebody surfing, cresting a wave, maybe in Waikiki Beach or someplace. Young people tend to be idealistic and upbeat, and it may be they would paint something like that. It may be their parents, maybe their father, would paint the picture of somebody in a boat taking water 50 miles from the shore with no help in sight. They say it's not the years, it's the miles. And because of the years and the miles a lot of the parents have had, they're pessimistic. Now in this closing illustration, Jesus is telling us what he would paint in the way of a picture when somebody speaks the word life. And the picture Jesus paints is not idealistic and it's not pessimistic, it's realistic. Jesus says this is life. 2 houses side by side, and storms just beating down on those houses, and waters, flood waters rising, winds blowing on those houses. Now this is realistic. What he's saying here is you got 2 kinds of people in this world, just 2 possibilities, but they both look alike until the storms come. But he's so realistic in his picture because he says everybody gets the storms. All the people represented by these 2 houses, and these 2 houses represent all people. Jesus is saying nobody has an immunity to the storms. A lot of people think that when you profess to be a follower of Jesus and follow him and become one of his disciples, you buy an immunity to storms, but that's not the case. The storms come to everybody, but Jesus said, as the storms beat upon and against these 2 houses, one house collapses and the other one stands. Because one house has a foundation and the other one doesn't. You know what the foundation is? He who hears this teaching of mine and actually implements it, appropriates it, applies it, obeys it. That's what the foundation is that keeps the house from falling. It's so practical, you see. He's not saying, I want people who know a lot, I want people who can say a lot. He's saying, I want people who understand and apply and obey. Those are the kinds of people that will be my solution and my answer. And the challenge is, now, 2 men in a pew, which one are you? To conclude all this teaching and this invitation, I'd like to read a poem that a black bishop in Africa said turned his life around when he was struggling with the decision to go against all the policies of the white people in Rhodesia when he decided to enter the political arena. He said somebody gave him this poem and it moved him to make the decision to risk everything. People are unreasonable and self-centered. Love people anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. If you are successful, you will win false friends and true enemies. Succeed anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness makes you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. The biggest people with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest minds. Think big anyway. People favor underdogs but follow only top dogs. Fight for some underdogs anyway. What you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. Build anyway. People may really need help, but they will attack you if you help them. Help people anyway. Give the world the best you've got and you get kicked in the teeth. Give the world the best you've got anyway. Give Jesus the best you've got and the world will kick you in the teeth. Give Jesus the best you've got anyway. That's the way Jesus concluded this great teaching at the first Christian retreat. I wonder if you can make the applications to your own heart and life. Where are you? Are you part of the problem or part of the solution? And then, what kind of a solution are you? Are you one of the many or the few? One of those who are false or one of those who are true? Are you one of those who say or one of those who do? Are you really and truly, in reality, the salt of the earth and the light of the world?
Well, that brings us to the end of another great series by Pastor Dick Woodward. It's our desire that you'll discover the wonderful truths found in the Word of God and apply them to your everyday life.